I mean, you could state it as a question, do you become vegan and then break with the cultural norm because of veganism? Or is it that you're someone who's already broken with the cultural norm and then finds it easy to engage with veganism? I see that, sincerely as a really interesting piece of the puzzle. And maybe that's also why it's so difficult to organize vegans, right? Because you got a bunch of different people and each one is kind of fragmented away from their own home culture, or rebelling against it, or acting out against it in different ways. But we're as different. We're as different as I am from Fully Raw Christina. We're as different as I am from Charles Marlowe. But even we're as different as I am from Gary Francione. I mean, I've got to say, it's the burden that I've lived with all my life. I really do feel that way. But veganism gave me a coherent framework and a lens to understand it and express it much better than before. In the strictest sense of the word perspective, it put all the other problems in perspective. You could see what was big and what was in fact small but close to you, in contrast to things that really were huge but perhaps, more remote.
À-bas-le-ciel.
The most value you've brought to the vegan movement, he says, so I'm quoting him, the most value you've brought to the vegan movement has been critique so far, but I think that will change as the different approaches become crystallized for people and for your collaborators. You've had a big impact on clarifying ideas for me, and I hope you will find your activist group and more or better vegan ones, and we can all inspire each other with real-world progress. So he says here he agrees with another YouTuber called Flemface about how it's easier to find veganism when you're already breaking with your own culture. Okay, this is doubtless true, and I think that's also true about my engagement with Buddhism and a lot of other things. I think Melissa has been reflecting on that in some ways because we've just gone back to visit your family and looked at a lot of things in your basement, see what you grew up with. But I mean, fundamentally, I was never comfortable in Canadian culture, period.
Yeah, I was never comfortable in the culture that I grew up with either.
Right. So it's interesting.
I always felt distanced from it.
I mean, you could state it as a question. Do you become vegan and then break with the cultural norm because of veganism? Or is it that you're someone who's already broken with the cultural norm and then finds it easy to engage with veganism? And for some people it's going to be both or something, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be all one or the other. But no, I mean, I was really disgusted with my own culture. I could go over some of the things. And of course, it relates to particular political events prior to 2001, relates to all these things. But sure, I don't know what it would be like for someone who loves, being an American, who loves living in Texas and is loves and is totally comfortable with that culture, and watches football games and everything else, and yet they're vegan. We see that with the health-based vegans and so on often enough. But in terms of ethical veganism, I mean, once you're an ethical vegan, once you see the world in those terms, even just from the ecological perspective, how do you still watch football the way you did before? Yeah, I mean that sincerely. I don't mean that as a taunt or an insult to someone. Like, what is the meaning of your life now? Watching football and, doing those other things you used to do. Because from my perspective, ethical veganism, even if you just think about the ecological aspect, you think about the millions of animals dying in cages all around the world. And now here you are at this football game, even though you personally aren't eating ribs at the football game and everyone else is. It must suddenly make the other things in your life seem, meaningless, and not just meaningless, but pernicious, as part of the destruction of the world as opposed to saving the world, as part of a meaningless, self-indulgent, and destructive life as opposed to a meaningful and helpful one. So, again, and I'm not saying this to insult her nor to flatter her, but you can compare that to someone in Texas like Fully Raw Christina. Fully Raw Christina obviously could never fit in Texas in a million different ways. And then, she is Texan. She lives in Texas. But it's not surprising she ended up where she's at, I guess, from that perspective. So, no, I see that, sincerely as a really interesting piece of the puzzle. And maybe that's also why it's so difficult to organize vegans, right? Because you got a bunch of different people, and each one is kind of fragmented away from their own home culture, or rebelling against it, or acting out against it in different ways. But we're as different. We're as different as I am from Fully Raw Christina. We're as different as I am from Charles Marlowe. But even we're as different as I am from Gary Francione. I mean, think about that guy. I mean, Gary Francione, he obviously is incredibly uncomfortable with the culture he's a part of, Gary Francione. You get that rage and that sorrow in everything he does, just dissatisfaction too, just rancor, but he's a salaried professor. I don't know if he's retired now, in many ways he's a member of the establishment and so on. So, and yeah, getting any 2 or 3 of those people to cooperate seems to be impossible, even though I have so much in common with someone like Gary Francione. We can't even agree on how to pronounce his name. And I mean, I guess I can get into this in a separate video, but for all of us, I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to, is the number of hours in a day, and how you can make any of these aspirations, to save the world, compatible with the challenge of keeping a roof over your head, or providing a decent standard of living to your own kids if you have kids, or any of these other things. I remember, so there's a saying in Buddhism, this is in Mahayana Buddhism, but they say, it is in some moderately ancient texts, but not the most ancient text in Buddhism, where it says, practice the Dharma as if your hat is on fire, as if you're wearing a hat that's on fire. And, a lot of religions have that spirit of, like, the world is going to end, so work really hard and devote yourself to this or whatever. I mean, veganism, it's weird. I don't feel that the world is going to end. I feel that the world is bad and is getting worse. But I mean, it's an absolutely horrible cosmology we live with as vegans, ethically and ecologically. And, I do still ask myself that question every day, how would you live your life if you were trying to save the world? I have a daughter. My daughter's 4 years old. I do prioritize spending time with my daughter. I do burn the jet fuel to fly from Canada to France and spend my 15 days with my daughter, and all these things. But sure, when we're looking at these options, so he's talking about getting a university degree and being a tree surgeon, doing something linked to ecology. I went to, back when I was a political science major, I went to and I took classes in the Department of Ecology at another university. Not worth telling the whole story, but it was a ton of work. It was taking the subway for so many hours across town, and then you get out and take a bus to go from one university to the other, just to be in this Department of Ecology. And I was trying to talk to people there, because I really thought at that time I should maybe switch my major from political science to ecology, or something like political ecology. I was wanting to make it, and of course when I got there, department's a joke, the courses are a waste of your time. It is. What universities are. We've done a million videos talking about that. But my problem is I have no delusion. It would be a wonderful delusion if I thought that getting a PhD in ecology could make any difference in the world, even on this YouTube channel. I don't think if I got a PhD in ecology it would even help this YouTube channel in any way. I don't think it would help the vegan world in any way. If I got a PhD in ecology, I don't think there's anything I could do that Gary Francione hasn't already done, or even that Gary Yourofsky hasn't already done, without having a PhD in ecology, And I don't think they'd teach me anything I couldn't learn, okay, I don't mean that. They would teach me a lot of things, but they wouldn't teach me what I'd need to know to move beyond what people like Gary Francione and Gary Yourofsky have already done. So both of us are people now who are looking at more higher education. We had a video on it recently, looking at whether or not we should become lawyers, go to law school. But then you look at that and you contrast it to, going to get a degree in culinary arts, getting a degree in baking, getting a degree in pastries, working in a kitchen, rolling out bread, and ask yourself what can really be a platform for making that difference in the world. Anyway, it's heavy. So we were laughing and joking around a lot before we came on camera. But I mean, that it really is the burden. I mean, I've got to say, it's the burden that I've lived with all my life. I really do feel that way. But veganism gave me a coherent framework and a lens to understand it and express it much better than before. Because Melissa was exactly like me in this. Before I was vegan, I cared way more about never owning a car. And by the way, I still never have owned a car. I still never have driven a car. Right? And then after I was vegan, you see that kind of thing in this much, much more meaningful, quantitative framework. And I remember, like, some of my ex-girlfriends, when I first got with them, they were really hyper about never using a plastic bag. And I said to them, do you want me to show you the stats? Do you want me to show you what percentage of the human waste stream, that's what people call it, the human waste stream, is reusable plastic bags. Do you want me to show that and the difference between using a reusable and a disposable? Do you want me to show that? I can get you that now. And in some studies, the reusable plastic bags cause more garbage than the disposable. It's a really near thing. It's like, okay, and now do you want to look at the difference between, meat versus tofu? This kind of thing. I'm not saying veganism's the only, ecological or ethical cause, but veganism was both the ineluctable conclusion of those questions and those misgivings, and it was also something where once I switched into veganism, all those other questions, made more sense. It precisely, in the strictest sense of the word perspective, it put all the other problems in perspective. You could see what was big and what was in fact small but close to you, in contrast to things that really were huge but perhaps, more remote.
À-bas-le-ciel.